Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. We had a small delay, but there is now no problem to hold this last session of this digital workshop. So this is my pleasure to moderate the fourth session of the digital workshop. My name is Thierry Schneider. I'm the new chair of ICRP Committee 4 since last July. And this fourth session is really dedicated to some issues which are mainly at stake with Committee 4 on application and practice. Some link clearly with the previous sessions that we had today and the sessions that we had yesterday as well. And I hope that we will have some lively discussion and some proposal to further challenge the improvement of the radiological protection system. So today we have five speakers coming from different countries, coming from different organizations, namely some experts or some regulators, or also some ethicists that will challenge how the system is implemented in practice and what are the key issues which need to be considered for the future of the radiological protection system. So without waiting, I will introduce the first speaker of this session, Dr. Doug Chambers. Dr. Doug Chambers is a physicist with more than 40 years of experience consulting for industry, government, and also various national and international organizations, both from Canada and US or other different organizations. And more recently, is challenging using nuclear to produce green hydrogen. Doug Chambers' current interests include risk assessment, dosimetry, and epidemiology. And today, Doug Chambers will discuss how to update the ICRP recommendation with the perspective of practitioners. So Doug, you have the floor for 12 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you. I'm going to briefly run over some of my personal experiences and hopefully identify some issues that will help ICRP move ahead, some of which are controversial. First, this is my perception of the international safety regime, with UNSCEAR looking into the scientific basis. ICRP, of course, does their own science following on with UNSCEAR, but basically they produce recommendations for radiation protection. And as we've heard already from previous speakers, the International Atomic Energy Agency has a large task in trying to develop regulatory guidance. I will get to the message. In Canada, we have a small modular reactor action plan. And Canada sees SMRs as a source of safe, clean, affordable energy, which is essential to achieving our 2050 carbon objectives. However, in order for this vision to be achieved, it's absolutely essential that the public and Indigenous communities and others be comfortable that the technology is safe and the risks are socially acceptable. That's a huge issue, as we've heard several times earlier. A recent public opinion survey in Saskatchewan, Ontario, concluded that scientists are the most trusted source of information. Elected officials are the least trusted. Generally, people don't trust our governments, provincial or federal, in Canada, and I suspect that's true elsewhere as well. Fortunately, the CNSC in Canada appears to be doing a great job, and they were the second most trusted source of information. Scientists and others contribute to the work of UNSCEAR and ICRP, and these organizations provide the basis for scientific assessment of radiation effects and also for radiation protection guidance. And the recommendations to the ICRP need not only to be scientifically sound, but must also be interpretable by members of the public. And to be honest, the system is complex and some of the language is difficult to follow, even for me. I'm going to talk about ALARA briefly. Principally, ALARA is misused, at least in my experience, as low as reasonably achievable. Simply put, I guess my view is, as ICRP states as well, there has to be some rationale, some reasonableness in the implementation, and we've heard several speakers talk about this before. However, my experience has also been, and it's sometimes interpreted, that ALARA is made to go to zero dose. That's not possible. And many people, particularly NGOs, don't care what the cost is and be damned the expense. And that doesn't help. I also agree with Roger and others that our over effort on radiation protection may actually have a negative effect on public opinion. This is a picture I adopted from NCRP 160 to provide some context. We've talked about this before. In the US, we see that the vertical axis is number of people, horizontal axis is annual effective dose. The arithmetic mean is about 3 millisieverts. That's quite large, with several million people experiencing doses above 20 millisieverts. And I point out the standard deviation is about 3.6 millisieverts as well. So we've talked about ALARA, and in Canada we did a study looking at alternative reactors for Darlington, and the doses from 4 reactor types were all less than 10 microsieverts per year. We actually had people said, tell us, why don't you do an optimization between 6 microsieverts a year and 8 microsieverts a year? I think the perception is out of context. And I would suggest that one thing that might be considered is a dose cutoff for ALARA assessments. As Don has alluded, it's quite controversial, whether you call it de minimis or below regulatory concern. My perspective is when the dose is low, the risk is low, irrespective of dose response, which I'll talk about in a minute. 2008 and B, on a worldwide basis, is the average radiation exposures. From my personal perspective, and considering the previous slide, for a worker, a dose cutoff of perhaps 1 millisievert might be reasonable, and for a member of the public, a tenth of that in terms of relevance to workers, or perhaps even 0.3 millisieverts if you look at relevance to natural background. A few comments on dose response. We use linear models at the present for risk of solid cancers and linear quadratic for the risk of leukemia. The LNT model provides a pragmatic basis for radiation protection, but frankly, I'm not sure it's very good for risk assessment, and many other models can be envisioned. This is the same slide that was shown yesterday by Jacqueline, and I borrowed it from UNSCEAR 2012 Annex A. I'm not going to talk about it other than the fact that many different versions of dose response can be contemplated. Some with thresholds, some linearity, some superlinearity. We also talked briefly about the fact there's a great deal of uncertainty in the estimates of risk. This is a slide I borrowed from UNSCEAR 2019, and you can see the very wide error bars. And I'm not going to go into detailed discussions. This is a slide that illustrates that not everything is linear, no threshold. Left-hand side is the dose response curve from Roland. Shows the risk of bone sarcoma from the ingestion of radium-226. And the right-hand side is a slide I stole from Beer 4, showing various models with LNT across the top. And without going into model details, basically LNT for this particular reality is extremely conservative and unreasonably so. So we have to be open to dose response models, and not one dose response model fits all situations. This moves me into cataracts, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. I've lost track. Historically, they were classified as a deterministic effect, but since ICV 2018, I have a mistake in my slide. There's confusion now, in my mind anyways, between deterministic and stochastic effects. There's a blending, particularly with dose protraction. And the new recommendations for cataracts suggest a 0.5 gray acute or protracted cutoff. However, there's a great deal of uncertainty in the epidemiology, and I have some notes that you can look at later. In Canada, this shows the natural prevalence in Canadian males, which is one of the challenges in looking at cataracts. Even in Canada, there's a huge range in how cataracts occur with different ages. There's a natural oxidation that ongoes our whole life. There's many issues with cataracts, including differences in scoring and a number of other areas that have already been briefly talked about. This leads into detriment. Harmful radiation health effects are classified as stochastic effects, cancer, and heritable diseases, and harmful tissue reactions, which with the most recent pronouncements occur at about 0.5 gray for acute and protracted exposure. Concept of detriment is used to quantify harmful effects of radiation exposures at low doses and low dose rates, different measures of health. Discussion paper of Clement, Room, and Harrison, etc., suggests that late developing effects need to be considered in the expression of harm. My view is this is possible, but we need to be very careful about how we do this. And in particular, my personal view is that cataracts does not seem to be appropriate for inclusion in the detriment, given the very great differences between cataracts and other harmful effects such as cardiovascular. Briefly, I think that the ICRP review of the system of radiological protection is very timely and needed. As I mentioned previously, the work of the ICRP must be scientifically sound. The system of radiation protection is complex and perhaps overly complex. And I think the ICRP needs to make a strong effort not to diminish the science, but to provide some lay-readable summaries or short standalone reports of key aspects of ICRP. Frankly, ICRP documents are a mystery to virtually everyone who is not a radiation protection practitioner. And if we're going to communicate successfully with stakeholders beyond the scientific community, with members of the public, NGOs, and God bless us, even politicians, we have to be able to explain things in a simple way. And I made a few suggestions for consideration by ICRP in detail, and they're provided in the body of the paper. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Thierry.
Okay, thank you. You can stop sharing your screen, please, Douglas. No, you can keep on the camera, but stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So just one question which occurred notably in the chat. There is a discussion on the cutoffs that you emphasize in your presentation, in your paper. How you see the way to introduce a cutoff? First of all, what will be the interaction with the different audience? I can understand the audience with some people from industry, from different regulatory body, but what about the lay audience? That was one of the topic of your presentation. And do you see this introduction of cutoff as a simplification of the system, but when on what rationale? Because you mentioned that the system is already complex. How you see this specific issue?
Well, thank you very much. I guess my perception is that most people need to have a context that they feel comfortable with. And natural background radiation is one aspect. I think dose is much simpler than risk, which involves a lot of additional complications. So my proposal would be for again, I guess it is a complication, but to consider context of natural background dose. And I would also suggest, I agree with Roger when he said, I guess my opinion would be if have a dose below, say, millisievert, I don't see a need for complex and expensive optimization. Once you're low, you're low. So hopefully that's enough for now.
Okay, I think we can come back on this issue during the general discussion. There is another question with regard to one of your slides on ALARA, the slide ALARA 2. The question is, what is a group above 20 millisievert? There is a long gap before it. Are these people patient or workers? What you put in this specific group above 20 millisievert?
Yeah, I should clarify. There's a category of the annual dose, maximum dose in a year is 50 millisieverts for a worker, with 100 millisieverts over 5 years. However, in practical purposes, in Canada at least, if you have a worker who receives a dose of over 20 millisieverts, it generates lots of questions. So practically, you want to keep your dose below 20 and combine this with the application of ALARA, where you balance the dose reduction benefits with the cost. In Canada, at all facilities I'm aware of, the doses are actually kept well below 20, and indeed below 10, and in many cases below 5 millisieverts a year. But the 20 was, to my mind, a reasonable upper limit for a dose to the worker that I would not want to see exceeded.
Okay, thank you. So we will come back on some element during the general discussion. So thank you, Douglas, for your presentation. We will move now to the second speaker. The second speaker is coming from Sweden. I have the pleasure to introduce Nina Cromnier. Nina is a Director General of the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, which is a government regulatory authority responsible for both radiation protection, nuclear safety, and non-proliferation of radioactive material. The authority developed legislation and policy and authorize licenses and perform surveillance and inspection. And specifically, the presentation from Nina will focus on the need for bridging the gap between theory and practice. And this is an authority perspective in some identified areas for this short presentation. So Nina, you have the floor for 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Terry, and thank you also to ICRP for inviting me to speak in this seminar. As you can see, I do have, unfortunately, a camera that's not fully cooperating with me today, so I will turn my camera off now while doing the presentation in order not to create further disturbances while you're seeing my slides. So I hope that you can see my slides at the moment.
We had them before and now it's back to presenter mode.
Okay, sorry. Let's see. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So from a regulatory perspective, the ICRP recommendations really are a very key element, since they form the basis of legislation in different levels, be it national legislation, regional legislation, and also global legislation through the IAEA safety reference levels, safety standards, sorry. And they are being implemented across the world, as we heard yesterday. Maybe Mike, you can help me to shut off the camera because I didn't seem to find the right buttons here. Thank you. In general, I should start with saying that the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, SSM, we support a number of issues that ICRP is raising in the document, the Fit for Purpose paper. And we think that that really is a very good starting point for discussions on an international level over the coming years. And We also believe that the system as such, the radiation protection system, is a robust system, and it is to a very large extent fit for purpose as it is. But also from our perspective, having our experiences that we have gained from implementing and using the recommendations in regulatory work, we have found that there is a need for some clarifications and also some possible adjustments in some areas. And I will go through some of the areas here today that we have identified and look into those a little bit further. And the 4 areas are medical applications, the nuclear and radiological emergencies, potential exposure of workers, and protection of the environment. And maybe some of these areas could be candidates for thematic workshops, as mentioned by the ICRP chair, Werner Room, yesterday for the continued process. So I'll start with the medical applications, and the medical applications, as I'm sure you are aware, constitute a significant part of the planned exposure situations of radiation. And the area is also constantly changing with new medical technologies and also the use of new radioactive pharmaceuticals. That's also something that we heard about yesterday. And this in turn, of course, also results in changing conditions for the radiation protection system, and that changes continually. So the area is a complex one and includes the medical exposures as such, and those are of course purposeful, but then also gives the side effects of occupational exposure, exposure to the general public, and could also be exposure to the environment. Also, in some cases, it also gives exposure to the emergency preparedness field. So the basic principles, optimization, justification, and dose limitations are applied in different ways for different exposure situations. And I guess one of the most obvious differences is that the dose limits are not applied for medical exposures. So we feel that this is an area that is complex and really needs to be and poses challenges that need to be taken into account in the review process of the general recommendations. So what we see then is that there we have the theoretical framework of the ICRP recommendations in the medical applications field, and we also have the more practical guidelines, and we do have a number of those also, but we see that there is the link between the theoretical framework with the practical implementation guidelines is could be strengthened. And we think that this is important because if the link is not strong enough, it could be difficult to justify radiation protection measures if you're not seeing where they come from and that there's a clear line from the theoretical framework to the practical guidelines. And of course, if it's difficult to justify, then also the confidence in the system could be at stake. So we know that there are large differences between medical applications and other areas in radiation protection, and it's therefore important to actually see and clarify the difference, how to apply the basic principles, optimization, justification, and dose limitation, and how they can be addressed in the medical field and have a clarity in that. And in this respect, we suggest that while reviewing the recommendations 103, the general recommendations, we also suggest to review the publication 105, where the recommendation on applying the system to medical applications. In doing so, to do this parallel review means that the necessary clarifications on how to apply the system to medical applications could be put into the revised publication 105, and also to have clarity on different strategies, approaches, and other differences, so that medical applications could be an integrated part of the system of radiological protection. And here, of course, we find that it's important to involve appropriate competencies, and you may not be surprised when I'm going to say that we propose that it's important to involve the regulatory authorities and the competence that is found in the regulatory authorities in order to do this. So with that, I'll go over to the next area, which is the nuclear and radiological emergencies. And here we have 4 suggestions for guidance in this area. And the first suggestion is to develop guidance on exposure situations and the transition between them in connection with nuclear or radiological emergency. The difficulty, of course, is that different organizations have had different views on when a transition from the emergency situation goes into the more regular planned exposure situation. And here we suggest that we elaborate further guidance in this respect. Furthermore, we suggest that there's also developed guidance on the use of reference levels in the early and intermediate phases of a nuclear and radiological emergency. And for instance, the implications of using a common reference level for the public applications to the entire duration of the both early and intermediate phases in an emergency situation could be further looked into and discussed. The third suggestion in this area is that we're suggesting developing guidance on informed consent for responders in the early and intermediate phases of a nuclear or radiological emergency. And here we suggest that there's a clarification on the right of the responders to refuse to perform work assignments without any under certain circumstances where the exposure is particularly high. The fourth suggestion in this area is to develop guidance on protections of the responders undertaking recovery and restoration operations in the long-term phase of a nuclear or radiological emergency. For instance, when does the situation go into a planned exposure situation? Also here, that is a reasonable thing to further investigate. I will then move on to the next area, which is the area of potential exposure of workers. And this is something that we have in the Swedish context, we have revised our regulations where we've merged the requirements on radiation protection with those of the reactor safety for nuclear power plants. And the challenges that we've come across in doing so are that it has been difficult to compare the normal exposure situation with exposure of potential exposure based on probabilities, and how to put these things together into one set of recommendations for the design regulation of nuclear reactors. And when doing this work, we have seen that the publications of RCRP number 64 and 75 are a bit, they have been revised many years ago, but they are now not quite up to date, and we suggest that there is a potential for updating of these recommendations in order to create criteria for acceptability of risk, in particular for situations where probability for exposure is very low, but this results in high doses. And also we support the concept of risk constraints in addition to dose constraints in the optimization of protection and safety, as has been argued by the ICRP. And here's just summarizing more or less what I said, that we're suggesting the review of the guidance 64 and 76, and we support the review of the optimization principle. So I will move on to the next topic, and that is the environmental protection. And as you may know, Sweden has for many years been a very strong supporter of sustainable development and environmental protection. And we have come across a challenge in this respect where we were a couple of years back, we were reviewing our our regulation for the final repository of radioactive waste. And when doing this, we were trying to implement the Environmental Act in combination with the radiation protection regulations. And we found that in the Environmental Act, there's a requirement actually to show that there is no harm to the ecosystem, but also to the ecosystem services. And in this context, the method of using reference organisms, it's a good one, but it's not really enough to demonstrate the protection of the ecosystem services. And therefore, we would suggest that there's a further work to explore how indicators for protection of the ecosystems could be developed within the RCRP recommendations. And then I also just give a few observations relating to the protection of domestic animals. We see that in order to work further in this field, there is, at least to our knowledge, some scientific gaps in data on the animal sensitivity to ionizing radiation, and also between different species and so on. And also some practical aspects on how to implement these concerns in the regulation. And also there is some ethical aspects to at least think about. For instance, do we protect the domestic animals, and how do we then see it with the laboratory animals that are being part of research and development, etc. So there are a number of issues that probably needs to be further looked into in order to advance in this field. So in conclusion then, we think that the current ICRP system in most cases is a very robust and a good system, but we do have some suggestions on how to further improve it in order to bridge the gap between the theoretical system and practices, particularly in the field of clarifications and further guidance. And of course, we are very much interested in further working together with the ICRP and others in exploring these issues in the further process of the review of the general recommendations and other publications of the system in the coming years. And we're looking forward to having a continued dialogue in these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina, for this quite interesting presentation. So some of the topics that you mentioned are already on the agenda of Committee 3 and Committee 4. notably for addressing some element on the application of the framework or further development on the framework for medical exposure, notably, or some other with regard to potential exposure or protection of the environment. But the way you presented is quite useful to further challenge what could be done by ICRP and also by others. I have just one short question because we are running over time. You just mentioned the protection of the environment and the role of ecosystem service, which is quite new and which has not been explored by ICRP up to now. In which way your authorities is working on that and interact probably with some people in the chemical protection of chemical toxic?
Thank you for the question. And so far, we have more or less come across the issue and identified it as an issue, and that is a challenge. And we've started to work on it, but so far we don't have any concrete proposals on how actually to get there. So we would be happy to work with others in trying to find ways to discuss this further and see where we can go with this approach. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think we will come back on this element during the final discussion. Sorry, I will take the question later on, and we are now. It's time to move to the third presentation. The third presentation will be given by Dr. Elena Jancekovic. Elena is a physicist with decades of experience working in nuclear safety and radiation protection, senior inspector counselor at the Slovenian Nuclear Safety Administration. She is heavily involved in international arena, and notably she's still involved largely in the Article 31 group of experts advising for European Union on basic safety standard. And she's also interacting with IAEA for different missions. So Elena, you have the floor, and your talk will be focusing on ICRP 103 and authorization and inspection processes. So yeah, Elena, you have the floor for 12 minutes.
Thank you, Terry, very much. I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. So ladies and gentlemen, very briefly, I have to show an outline of my talk, but it doesn't work. It doesn't go down. Mike, can you please help me what to do?
You did a great job at
You can try resharing or closing and opening your PowerPoint again, but we do see your
Okay.
slides. We're just not, it's not advancing.
3 minutes left.
I will try now to, so I will close it and once again, okay. Can you see it now?
We can see your full PowerPoint
Yeah.
program, but
Okay.
you need to start the presentation.
Is it
Okay.
okay?
Yep, we see it.
Okay. Now it's okay. It's working. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So after a very short introduction, I will say a few words about authorization and inspection, and then I will focus on few selected open issues which are related to ICRP 103. At the end, I will give conclusions. So as it was said many times, from the ICRP recommendation, we produce international standards, directives, national legislation, and so on. Therefore, it's of the extreme importance to understand that any change in the recommendation will have a huge impact on all the documents I mentioned. So authorization and inspections are two of the main core processes, and usually inspections are somehow the most visible part. So we have to look to the fact that ICRP shall provide a very clear message how to implement recommendations, because basically authorization and inspections are decision-making processes. So there should be a very clear idea for the regulatory authority how to implement recommendations in the regulatory framework. We can look to recommendations somehow like kind of clouds. There are ideas how to do it, But basically, at the end, during authorization and inspection, we should have a crystal clear idea how to regulate, how to do things on sites. I would like to stress that implementation of the ICRP 103 was a huge endeavor for every country. For all countries, where actually updating of regulation was necessary, but also for newcomers, for countries who are actually just starting to have the very first regulatory framework. Therefore, we should be aware that any change in the ICRP recommendation might again start the cycle of this huge endeavor business. Of course, in every country, usually there are several tens of documents which should be updated. And we are still in the process of updating emergency plans, guides, strategies, laws, regulations, and so on, not to mention what is happening on in facilities. Of course, such updating requires very good cooperation with different parties, scientists, designers, and operators of facilities, and so on. So we should be aware of this huge endeavor. I selected 6 issues. I believe we need additional recommendations. Very first one is related to the justification and optimization. There are 2 principles, but they are somehow connected. If somebody would like to have a nuclear power plant and then to justify this, he or she will look, of course, to different risks. And one of the risks, one of the harm, will be radiological detriment. But of course, we are then jumping to the optimization and we are managing this detriment. And with this result, we come back to the justification. Therefore, I am very sure that it will be very helpful to have additional recommendation how to implement justification and optimization principles in this particular case or in cases like that one. The second emerging issue is related to practical implementation of justification principle, because in practice, we are confronted with applications for non-medical exposures, for example, for sport activities, control of weight, and so on. And it would be very, very useful actually to have a guidance how to implement justification process, because regulatory authorities are really struggling to find relevant stakeholders. We are struggling how to communicate with them. We are struggling how to reevaluate justification and so on. So further recommendation in this issue is really needed. The third issue is somehow related to the end of the lifetime of sources. We know that people are spending millions of money trying to protect the countries against orphan sources. So I believe that we should look to the justification principle at the end of the disuse sources so that countries will have a very clear system when it is not justified to put away a disuse source, which will become in week, month, or year an orphan source, because this is a huge burden for countries. So somehow I believe that ICRP might give some hints to regulatory authorities how to tackle re-justification for disuse sources. The fourth issue, I believe it is worth looking at, is related to those constraints, which are very nicely used when we are talking about occupational exposure. When we are talking about members of the public, I found quite a lot of confusion, because very often those constraints are, of course, they are not a regulatory limit, but those constraints for the members of the public are really very rarely used. Usually, a regulatory authority, when the regulatory authority is authorizing a facility, they set a regulatory limit, and that's the regulatory dose limit for the members of the public in the vicinity of the facility. And this is, of course, enforceable regulatory limit. It's not a dose constraint as such. So I believe there is some confusion what is a dose constraint and what is the regulatory limit for the members of the public. And I also have to mention one issue which is somehow related to graded approach. I find out that in many cases, the regulatory authorities are not keen to optimize below reference levels. Of course, the reference levels is a very difficult concept. We have to look first to the doses above reference levels. We have to focus on the doses above them. But of course, it will be very good to have a kind of guide when to optimize below, in what kind of circumstances. And this will somehow also go in line with the idea that every regulatory authority should first look to the doses above. In many cases, it's not really clear how to do this. And at the end, I have just a small proposal, which is related to COVID-19. Actually, all regulators were really shaken during COVID-19 crisis, because our way of working changed dramatically as elsewhere. And I believe it would be worth looking at what can we learn from this crisis, because I can say for my regulatory authority, we didn't have any problem with graded approach. For us, it was very clear how to reassess the risk and so on. So maybe it's a good idea to look what are the lessons learned from this really huge stress test under which we are actually now. And there is also one additional idea that the pandemic also taught us that we have to be very cautious with abstract concepts, because the general public might not understand or embrace abstract concepts. So it's very useful to have a very clear, very simple messages when we are discussing about radiation protection. So at the end, I would just like to say that regulatory authority is, of course, focused on decision-making processes, and we want to have everything in boxes. Everything should be very, very clear. This is not, of course, the case, but we would like to have really clear messages, clear concepts, because this helps us a lot. And in addition, all practical advices are going to be very welcome, because all regulators are trying to have state-of-the-art radiological standards in our own countries. Thank you for your attention. And particularly thank you, Mike, for all your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for this presentation. I really like your picture when you mentioned that authority need to have a crystal clear picture at the end, and this is clearly the interest to challenge the ICRP recommendation with regard to the practice of authority within inspection and all the process related to the authority. We have time for question. We have seen in the chat there is some people come back on this question of dose constraint and limits. This is really something to be further addressed. My question, notably with regard to justification, in which way the authority or which criteria the authority can use to address justification, and you have shown that justification could be organized at different stage of the life cycle of some activities, which is quite challenging. But then how the authority can do it?
Well, actually, I would be happy to have a kind of advice or a recommendation to have a clear, I would say, parameters to say this is a time to re-evaluate justification of a use or handling these resources. Because somehow we are always very much focused on initiating a practice, but we are not so much focused how to manage later on when actually the source is becoming a disease source. The IEA made a great job in this respect, but I believe it would be very helpful actually to say more in ICRP documents on this.
Okay, maybe this is something that on which we can come back during the general discussion. What, in your view, what is the role of ICRP? What should be done by ICRP? What should be done by other international organizations? What should be done in cooperation between ICRP and different organizations in connection with ICRP in the following years to challenge these different topics? I've also a last point. I check on the chat and the Q&A. One point you mentioned COVID-19, which is of course a specific situation which have changed the life of so many people and the organization of so many inspection and so on. How you see the implication for the recommendation of ICRP? For the organization of ICRP, I can see it, but for the recommendation itself, in which way we need to come back or to take into account COVID-19? What is your view on that?
Thank you very much. I was actually thinking more on the having a brainstorming on the influence of such a huge stress test on the system, on the regulatory framework, which is actually designed not for such stressful situation. So in the session before, one of our colleagues had a very nice presentation on graded approach. And I must say that during COVID crisis, it was crystal clear for every regulator what to do and what not to do. It means that we immediately made a clear justification of our inspections. We use graded approach immediately, where to go and where not to go. So somehow I believe it's worth looking if the system as such is enough robust to take into account such stressful situations.
Okay, thank you. And there is a short discussion with regard to the management of a source when it is disused, and there are some people mentioning that it should be part of the initial justification. And then, of course, the fact that you mentioned that justification could be done or during all life phases need to be challenged, and for sure there is a need to see, but this is an ongoing discussion with all ICRP publication to know what we put behind justification, and is it the general practice, or when we are in different exposure situation, what to do with that, and what is the role of justification. And so this is something to be surely clarified in the future, and the experience of regulator will be quite useful in this perspective. Okay, so thank you, Elena, and we will come back with some questions during the general discussion. Now we move to the fourth presentation. The fourth presentation will be given by Joseph Dlama. Joseph has a PhD in radiation protection, and is consultant and working at university, lecturer and resource person in training in radiation safety officer in Nigeria. He's involved in IAEA project in Africa for the establishment of diagnostics reference level, and his goal is to impact widely in radiation protection and safety in medicine. And Joseph is the coordinator of the Nigerian Clinical Diagnosis Reference Level Project. So, Joseph, you have the floor for 12 minutes to challenge education and training in radiation protection, bridging the gap to keep ICRP recommendation fit for purpose. A good objective. You have the floor.
My regards to all. I'm delighted to make this presentation in this novel and novel meeting. There's a digital workshop by International Commission on Radiation Protection. Just like it has been said, I'm making a presentation on education and training in radiation protection, bridging the gap to keep ICRP recommendations fit for purpose. This presentation was done by we took time to arrange this presentation with a conglomeration of researchers who has contributed immensely in the field of radiation protection. Some of them are professors, some of them are medical physicists, some are radiographers. We came together and brainstormed on how to chart a way forward for ICRP recommendations, and in order to keep it fit for purpose and to provide a solution and a suggestion for a way forward. So I'm looking at the presentation from making a concise vision and plan with regards to radiation protection practice globally, then having some strategic directions with regards to some thematic areas, such as research and education, training, profiling leadership, or developing capacity in leadership and administration in radiation protection, then looking at the previous ICRP recommendation, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats, then also coming up with a suggestion and a recommendation on the way forward. So the strategic planning on, we were able to look at, first of all, in order to keep ICRP recommendation keep for purpose, we first of all need an integrated and dogged approach, in the sense that we have to review all the systems of radiation protection. We need to come up with a framework and a teamwork that will gather all the points in the ICRP recommendations, looking at it from one point to the other and itemizing it and looking at how it has been applied. What are the necessary challenges that we were faced with in the field, both in the practice of radiation protection, both in medicine and at environmental level. Then we also need to approach it via a dogged approach. And how can we approach it that way? By coming up with a team of professionals to look into that, and then suggesting a way forward. Another point that we need to look at is harmonization of the contents of the courses. We need to harmonize the practice of radiation protection, looking at the recommendations, the annals of ICRP. For example, we have ICRP publication 113 on education and training in radiation protection for diagnosis and interventional procedures. There is need for harmonization, coming up with a structured methodology for those assessments, coming up with a structured pattern for how we can receive information, and also communication. Effective communication is key. Then training of the trainers, most especially in areas of radiation safety, radiation transport of radioactive substances. There is need for training, and training equips both the trainee and the trainer on effective dissemination plan and effective practical approach to radiation protection. Then there is need for us also to prioritize. Prioritizing policies in radiation protection is key. Then dissemination of experience and knowledge through the regulatory bodies, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Commission for Radiation Protection, then coming down to countries, different countries, where regulatory authorities and various associations will play a major role or a critical role among the professionals, the professionals that makes use of radiation or are licensed to dispense radiation or makes use of one radiation appliances or the other. Then focusing on developing countries for training in radiation protection areas. I think the recommendations should focus on developing countries. Developed countries quite they make use of the radiation protection policies adequately, but in some developing countries, there is actually a gap that needs to be filled, looking at areas of technicalities, technical areas, areas of training, areas of equipping, then supply of equipment that will advance the practice of radiation protection. Then there is also a need to establish a system for credentializing radiation protection training program. And this can be done through a strategic plan. And this strategic plan should come with a vision, which will give direction, then mission, then having a concise and structured objective that will address the pertinent challenges in radiation protection. Then coming up with a strategy that will be able to stand as a nexus in providing solution to the recommendations based on various ICRP documents. Then the approach to practice also needs to be looked into, and then the tactics or policy methodology to be applied is very, very, very important. Now, how can this be achieved? There is need for continuous improvement. And I'm glad that this digital workshop comes with, it gathers professionals who will come together and give direction also and suggest way forward so that ICRP and the radiation protection will be of greater and immense use to the global community. So there is need for commitment to higher standard of professionalism. Then we need to drive innovations in teaching and learning, most especially at from the regulatory bodies within the countries, for training institute and research institutes in radiation protection. Then the essence of coming up with an innovation is that it contributes to breakthroughs in science and the practice of radiation protection. Then another angle that we need to look at is student engagement and successes. Establishing students and young radiation protection club in institutions and conferences helps to boost the policies of ICRP. By the time that at training level we are equipped with that, it will go a long way to actually enable competence in the practice. Then coming up with a curriculum and program that enriches learning and accomplishes the vision and mission of IAEA and ICRP recommendations and annals, and putting them in place is of great and immense importance. Then community development and collaboration. There is need for wider awareness and outreach programs that will help radiation protection. Then how do we come up with that? There is need for us to develop a framework for ICRP recommendations with actionable plan through research and innovation, through teaching and learning, through community development, and through collaboration and global networking. These are a research that we conducted on clinical indication diagnostic reference levels for pediatric head computed tomography examination in Nigeria. And so many issues came up from this research that enhances the training and capabilities of radiation protection within our community. And several references have been made to ICRP recommendation. So we can use this as we've been using this as a document also in teaching researchers, association, regulatory bodies, and also to come up with a diagnostic reference levels that will help in optimizing dose within our setting. And this has to do with collaboration and also networking. And this enables us to engage in community development through a comprehensive healthcare development services. Then another area we need to look at is progressive problem solving with realistic action plan. Now, looking at the ICRP recommendations, what has been done? What is yet to be done? And coming up with a specific direction that will guide us. And I believe this digital workshop is apt because it gives us a study plan and it will guide us on how to take action, how to collect and analyze the evidence received from this digital workshop, and to reflect on it in order to come up with policies that will further disseminate and affect the global community in terms of radiation protection policies and practice. And we can't neglect the fact that training is an imperative necessity in radiation protection. And one of the researches we've done in order to improve that within our locality is we looked at the Bonn call for action And we came up with a work that is, we came up with a work that declared the unfinished tasks in radiation protection, most especially in pediatrics, in adults, in adolescents, and in low and middle income countries. We focused on sub-Saharan Africa, which is an area that is not focused when it comes to the practice of radiation protection. So we're able to come up with that to improve the practice of radiation protection and to come and to discuss also the ICRP recommendations in order to come up with a concise and a well-dogged approach that will improve the practice. So generally, as a way of conclusion, a lot of efforts in research, innovation, training, and teaching method, communication, both verbal and non-verbal, feedback mechanism is a mandatory task for ICRP recommendations in order to keep it fit for purpose. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm delighted to make this presentation in this digital workshop, and I hope that ICRP will take us to the next level by keeping the radiation protection recommendations fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for emphasizing this quite important issue of education and training. We had a presentation yesterday in the first session on this topic, but then you further you continue on this discussion to challenge the preparation of roadmap, strategic plan with regard to education and training. And once again, as you mentioned, there is clearly a need to interact with different international organization, national organization in this perspective. So we have time for a few questions. I don't see some element currently in the chat. One point, because in fact, as you mentioned, the digital workshop is one element to contribute, to disseminate, and to interact with different people who are in charge of implementing the radiation protection system. There is also, since a few years now, the development of ICRpedia on the ICRP website, and the organization of the ICRP symposium since several times. What, in your view, what could be specifically developed by ICRP in order to foster education and training and to better disseminate or interact with practitioners on the radiation protection system and the recommendation from ICRP? Do you have some specific element, material which should be needed?
Yes, I just like we have the ICRP recommendation on education and training, I think there is need for us to also come and review it and then disseminate it. There should be also training in our website to also disseminate the plan of ICRP and to come up with a concise approach that will help in increasing the doggedness of the approach. And one of the areas we can do that is by research. We can't, research is indispensable in advancing this course, and we need also to train various professionals at different levels to come up with an approach on that. Then we need also, most especially looking at into COVID-19, this COVID-19 era, there is need for us to develop trainings via our websites that will further disseminate ICRP recommendation and in order to keep it fit for purpose.
You also mentioned the specific publication which have been developed for the medical field. on education and training. Do you have the feeling that there is a need to do some similar publication or similar reflection at the ICRP level to disseminate the recommendation of ICRP in other domains than medicine?
Yes, I suggest it should be reviewed also. There is need for the ICRP to look into it and review it, most especially looking at the practice and the technological advances in the current practice of radiation, most especially in areas of nuclear medicine and radiotherapy. There is need for a review of the curriculum on education and training, because with time, practices change. Practices there may be a slight difference in the approach of technology, and there is need for ICRP to come up with that. And in this era of artificial intelligence and machine learning, there is need for us to look into that area in education and training, artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a quite important issue to allow the system being fit for purpose, to be sure that we have a good education and training and do good dissemination. So thank you for emphasizing this point. So we are moving now to the fifth presentation from this session. The fifth presentation will be given by Jim Malone. Jim is a Robert Boyle Professor Emeritus of Medical Physics, and he was Dean of the Medical School at Trinity College in Dublin, in Ireland. He works and he was working and is still working regularly with various international organizations, including WHO, IAEA, ICRP, European Commission. And his recent publication include books on ethics for radiation protection in medicine and mystery and the culture of science. And with a colleague, is currently preparing or finalizing a book on LNT, uncertainty, and the system of radiological protection in medicine. So Jim will present the ICRP and a century of governance and ethics for radiation protection in medicine. So Jim, you have the floor for 12 minutes.
So Thierry, members and officers of the Commission and colleagues, greetings from Dublin, where we have a nice afternoon and the sun is shining brightly. So I hope you may even see it in the background. This short paper attempts to draw some lessons from a historical narrative on a century of medical radiation protection published in the European Journal for Medical Physics, and a link to the publication is in the final slide. It's firmly grounded in documentary research, principally excavating ICRP's new open access online archive. The paper would not have been possible without this archive and also draws on other publications. It finds much to commend in the work of ICRP throughout its history, and I'm absolutely sure that radiation protection in general and in medicine and in my own country is much better than it would be if we had been left to our own devices. Nevertheless, a critical reading of the history gives much that should at the very least be reviewed rigorously and possibly changed. I look at just 4 areas from many, many possible topics. And the 4 areas are governance and independence, the medical dose limit and exemption, or the exemption from dose limits in medical diagnosis and treatment, the level and quality of attention to medical radiation protection. And in this, I'm echoing a little of what Nina said earlier. And finally, ethics and the benefits harms dilemma that lies at the heart of many of our problems. And these have a lot of the sentiments, I think, here have at least in part been shared by earlier contributions. But before moving on, I'd like to draw your attention to a quotation from the introduction to The Doctor's Dilemma, a play by George Bernard Shaw, in which he said, "All professions are conspiracies against the laity, And I think this is not a bad framework to have when we're looking at this topic. So to move on to the governance commentary. In 1928, the International Congress of Radiology, at its second International Congress in Stockholm, issued a 3.5-page typed document on radiation protection. This document is the precursor of all ICRP recommendations, and in some ways might be regarded as the first. Much later, ICRP sets out in the 1955 publication its view on, or not its view, it sets out how the commission is appointed. And I'll read briefly from this. Selection of members of ICRP shall be made by the ICRP from nominations submitted to it by the national delegations to the International Congress of Radiology and by the ICRP itself. The selection shall be subject to the approval of the International Executive Committee of the Congress. The membership of ICRP shall be approved during each International Congress. And this is important, it's critical, and it gives us a very useful perspective. The Commission could hardly be more exposed to a powerful interest group professionally devoted to the use of radiation in medicine. This, to me, raises an alert and is probably reflected in the recommendations. Nevertheless, scientists were proud of the ICRP framework. I was, and I recall it well, particularly during the 70s and 80s. It appeared scientific, coherent, quantitative, internally consistent, and evidence-based. It was authoritative, but on reflection, it was also highly paternalistic. Indeed, it was Vatican-like, but many medical physicists still liked it. Indeed, it had an addictive certainty where certainty didn't exist, and I think this appealed to the physics mind. This voice is still present in the most recent recommendations in ICRP 103. 2 generations of application lapsed before the underlying assumptions began to be widely questioned, and some of the questions being raised are similar to those that Nina raised in her presentation earlier in this session. So I look now at the next of the 4 topics, and that is the dose limit issue for medical exposures. There's an exemption from dose limits for medical exposures. And as far as I could see from reading the history, rigorous discussion is absent from the recommendations on why this exemption is given. If you look at ICRP number 1 in 1959, the medical exposure is excluded from dose limits as a matter of practical necessity. And I think there the argument and discussion on it stopped. There's been no rigorously reviewed, open and transparent discussion on the matter since, to the best of my knowledge. And I would suggest it's worthy of review. There are some comments on justification and optimization that are close to the issue, but they don't actually really provide an adequate basis for taking it forward. There is a prescribing model with regards to pharmaceuticals that I think might be looked at, where there's a hard limit on what most doctors will prescribe in ordinary circumstances. The next one is to look at the focus, the level of focus in the recommendations documents as they've come to us. And in speaking about this, I'd like to emphasize that the recommendations have a special status in the publications of the Commission over and above the status of reports, because the recommendations are often taken over into legislation or into the programs of the international bodies. There are numerous reports, and there's an addiction to reports in the medical area, which are of varying quality and indeed of varying relevance. But the recommendations have a special standing over and above that. And looking at the appearance of medical issues in the recommendations, in 4 of the sets of recommendations, just as examples, it's fairly similar in the others. In 1928, there was one mention of a medical issue in a 3.5-page document. In 1959, in ICRP1, a half page out of 22 were given to medical issues. In 1977, out of a 130-page document in ICRP 26, which is really the foundation for how we do things today, 2.5 pages out of 130 was given to medical. In 1990, in ICRP 60, 1 page out of almost 200, and in 2007, 8 pages out of 320. Now, this is for the main use of man-made radiation. So I think there is a sense in which the medical problems have been sidelined into reports and didn't get into recommendations. And some really critical issues didn't even get adequate attention in the reports. I would argue that justification and optimization need a lot more work in the ICRP reports and recommendations. There are issues around pregnant patients, which still don't have an adequate treatment in the ICRP documentation. It's timid, what's there at the moment. And there's reticence among regulators with regard to some aspects of medical practice that I suspect reflects the approach within the ICRP recommendations. There's the dose limit exemption that we've just spoken about, and there are many other deficits which we could talk about for a long time. The only two I will mention briefly are poor engagement with the humanities and social sciences, and the use of the CVERT for the use of one unit, as it were, for two different quantities, which makes communication really just unconscionably difficult. Moving on and to talk a little bit about the ethics and the benefits and harms situation. I think in terms of ethics, you'll be aware of that there's much to celebrate in Report 138, which deals with ethics in general, and the work of TG 109, and other reports mentioned already earlier today by Nicole and Frido. Yet both of the 138 and 109 work are largely silent on the rich heritage and tradition of medical ethics, but much remains to be done in ethics for medical radiation protection, and a major culture change is required, and WHO is actually active in this area at the moment. In addition, there's a societal context in which we work, the society in which we work in general, and the society values have moved on. For example, President von der Leyen of the European Commission said recently that our youth put meaning into empathy and solidarity, and while they're anxious about the future, they're determined to make it better. And it's interesting to see these values promoted in lay society when we haven't yet fully adopted them in radiation protection in medicine. The benefits and harms dilemmas lie at the heart of many of our problems. The Commission's attempt to create a rigorous quantitative framework for the trade-off between benefits and harms may be overambitious. Problems in how we treat harms have been mentioned by many contributors today and yesterday, and in the on-demand presentations. Not just the LNT and how to quantitate harms, but also in the range of harms being considered. Looking through the presentations, diabetes, evacuation of people, justification in medicine, overdiagnosis, overtreatment, underdiagnosis, undertreatment, and indeed, not just the harms themselves, but how to classify them, and so on. On the benefit side, in medicine, the problem is even greater, and there's practically no high-level work on diagnostic imaging to see what the benefits to society are. And then when we have benefits and harms, both with relatively unsatisfactory and relatively uncomprehensive treatment, we divide the apples by the oranges to give us something that we can work with. I think there's a kind of a fallacy in this that people accustomed to science should be very alert to, but for one reason or another, people seem happy to proceed. A good way to approach this may be to marry both the ethics and the benefit harms problem together quite closely as an experiment for a period. Rather than use just cancer incidents, fatalities or cures to quantify benefits or harms, we could use ethics as a lens to amplify and highlight the broad range of effects that we miss with both. To move on and to move towards a conclusion, although I've not talked about them much, ICRP's often incisive contributions were critical to the development of radiation protection throughout the world. While the Commission strongly protected itself from some conflicts of interest, its distinct voice retains the accent and the register of language used in its earlier years within the sphere of influence of ICR. I should say that that register of language isn't present in the Secretariat at the moment, but it's still present in ICRP 103. That tradition is probably in part, at least, for some of the are responsible for some of the hands-off approach to medical recommendations. So, as I said, to move towards a conclusion, I won't speak to this slide, which carries a list of things I feel would be worthy of critically reviewing. You can visit it later on your own time. Wordsworth said that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. This list is not poetry, but it needs tranquility. The Commission's work has been formative and important, but much more can be achieved to guide ethical medical uses of radiation consistent with good practice. And finally, the reference to the paper on which this talk is based is at the bottom of this final slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for this presentation and the challenge that you put on the governance of ICRP and how to move forward based on medical field, but broader. I think I have one question which emerged with your presentation. You clearly emphasize the issue of independency of ICRP and with regard to the application of the system in the medical field. How can we improve this aspect? What could be your recommendation with regard to that? And in fact, to be practical, ICRP need to interact with directly with medical specialists. So how to overcome this ethical challenge that you clearly mentioned in the governance of ICRP?
I think I suppose it's a difficult challenge. That I agree, and I think the first thing that's important is in finding a way to approach it is to acknowledge that there may be an issue there. I'm not sure that it would be widely acknowledged, but I feel it is a real issue. And having said that, then I think the approach one might take, if one agreed that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, is to look at how appointments to the Commission are made. And I think that probably is the key to it, that looking at the method of appointment to the Commission, I would say it almost exactly mirrors the manner in which the Catholic Church appoints bishops, that it's a fairly internal process to the Commission, even though people can put themselves forward. So I would suggest that at some point, one option, there are many, many ways in which you can change that. And I don't make this particular suggestion other than to illustrate that there are other possibilities, that I would suggest that nominations might be invited from some bodies where the Commission doesn't have control over the nominations. It's just one suggestion, but there are many.
Yeah. Okay. In fact, we may emphasize that ICRP is clearly following the rules of charity as a UK registration. So this is some element which are quite important, but maybe according to your suggestion, it should be good to further challenge this aspect. I have another point which occurs. You emphasize the importance of considering science and also uncertainty associated with science, and then how to proceed to better address and to incorporate due consideration on uncertainty in the application of the system.
I think, again, the important point here, I think, is similar to the last one. I think the manner in which we make, in which the whole system relies, and the narrative of justification, for example, and of optimization and ALARA relies on the benefit-harms equation. And I think there's not a strong appreciation of how fragile that is. It's a relatively, except in medicine, for example, there is one situation where you can get a very exact answer to the benefit-harms equation, where there's absolutely no benefit. In other words, the benefit is zero. It's very easy to get an answer there. And in a lot of cases where examinations aren't justified, it's clear, the benefit-risk equation is very, very clear. But in most cases, the benefits are very uncertain and the harms are equally uncertain. And the scope of what's admitted as a benefit or a detriment doesn't strongly reflect what the real benefits and detriments are in the experiential life of the wider community. So I think there's a need to continue with the system as it stands, but also to pause in terms of reflecting on how to improve this situation. And one part of improving it requires that one acknowledge the uncertainty is a big problem. I think it's a central problem, and I think we're not going to clear up the uncertainty in the LNT in the period of, in my lifetime or in yours or in even Joseph's, who was much younger than both of us. So I think the uncertainty will be with us for a long time, and I feel we should, rather than be addicted to certainty, we should be happy that we have to live with uncertainty. And I suspect that may make us more acceptable in the wider community.
Okay, thank you. So I suggest that now we move to the general discussion. We have around 25 minutes left before the end of the session. So if I will ask all the speakers to switch on their camera. So there are first topics that we may discuss according to the questions that we receive, and which is directly in line with the last comment from Jim. All this question of uncertainty, or also there are several discussions on simplification of the system to introduce cutoff. What could be, and there is a question, notably if a limit below which optimization is deemed non-productive. Does this not mean that optimization of chest X-ray with effective dose at less than 20 microsievert from a dose perspective is also non-productive? And however, the optimization of image quality and diagnosis outcome is desirable. And there are also some other aspects which have been put in the chat with regard to this specific issue of simplification, cutoff, and discussion with expert authority and the public. So if someone want to jump on this question, several of you address this point, notably Douglas, you mentioned it. If you want to start.
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments. Jim raised some interesting points. Comment that I have, or suggestion I have, is effective dose is a useful concept, but I'm not certain it should be used for optimization in all cases. And I think we have to think carefully about the use of effective dose and absorbed dose. For example, I think that raises other issues. One is a physical quantity, and one involves the adoption of other information, organ weighting factors and RBE, etc. So I think that's a consideration.
Yes, thank you. Someone, Nina, you want to comment on that?
I could just give a general comment to the issue of simplification, and of course, as a regulator, we always would like things to be simple because then they are easy to regulate. At the same time, maybe sometimes it's not possible, and we see the radiation protection system as such is a complex issue, and I think that we can come a long ways with further clarifications and further guidance in the spirit of making things understandable for the general public as well as for us as users of the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one recommendation, please switch off your microphone when you are not speaking. So you Douglas, you want to come back on this comment?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a point that Jim raised, and I agree with it. We live with uncertainty in all our activities. And I think that acknowledging uncertainty in our dose response and our estimates, in fact, and everything is useful. But what we have to deal with is making decisions despite the uncertainty. So I think some discussion of how to make decisions in the face of uncertainty that is always there is a worthwhile topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Elena, you want to comment on this topic?
Thank you very much. I would just like to say that regarding uncertainties, we have a very different types of uncertainties. So I believe that we should be very careful when we are addressing uncertainties as such, as a one concept. Because if somebody would like to have a site, a nuclear site somewhere, there will be one type of uncertainty about site, the second type of uncertainty about radiation as such, and so on. So I believe that honesty is the only somehow, and transparency is the only solution. So that we put everything on the table and we say very clearly, we don't know, and with this we have to live. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Joseph, you want to continue?
I want to just talk on the area of dose optimization and image optimization. There is need for us to focus widely on setting policies that will help in, most especially in medical practice. There is need for us to look into the area of dose optimization, coming up with a concise approach, and looking into the various those reference level that will be applied to ensure that optimization is given detailed and comprehensive focus when it comes to the practice in keeping it fit for purpose.
Okay, thank you. Jim, you want to add something to your first comment? Unmute your microphone, please, Jim.
Yeah. I think just to be clear, my comment was most strongly aimed at the medical area, where the experience of uncertainty is in the context of people's medical problems, which carry huge uncertainties anyway, that even at the level of will the tablets work, or how long have I got to live, or many uncertainties. And when you talk to people, or when people are worried about the doses associated with a CT scan, and you say to them, well, we think that this is, if you're worried about the risk, we think that this is what it is. We're not sure, but we think it's what it is. And we have no reason to think it's any worse than that. People are generally happy with that, and they don't get worried or excited or uptight about it, and they don't ask you about the LNT or anything to do with it. So I think it's possible to manage those kind of risks in a very personal, individual way. On the wider thing, I would agree that I think we have to manage uncertainty, and we have to do it in a way that's consistent with good decisions.
Okay, thank you. So according to the time schedule, I suggest to move to another issue which have been emphasized, and there is a question that I would like to ask to all the panel members, if it would be helpful to enlarge the description of justification to more levels, like ICRP has done for medicine. So what is your point of view with regard to justification? And I would say both for what could be done from ICRP point of view, and what is your expectation as regulator, as expert, and also what could be your view when we will address this issue with different stakeholders, depending on the exposure situation. So who want to start on this topic? Yeah, Elena?
Thank you very much. I would be very happy to have somehow, in a way, practical examples how to tackle justification in other areas, and what was taken on board when people decided, and how they took into account also optimization. So this will be very, very beneficial. I know that ICRP documents are not written like a tech doc or something like that, but it would be very useful to have certain, I would say, focused examples explaining how to implement justification. Because now every country, every regulator is doing something, and then we are looking to each other what to do and so on. But it would be very beneficial if, for let's say, for some specific cases, it will be advised how to do it, either for NORAM or a legacy site or new nuclear power plants, small modular reactors, a first of that kind, or things like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Douglas, if you want to continue.
Yes, thank you. I think the ICRP should discuss this, but I think we have to be careful to avoid becoming too specific in our guidance, because each situation may be different. I've been at public meetings in Northern Canada where we're talking about, for example, a new uranium mine, and I've had people come up and ask me, is it safe? My husband, my daughter, my wife actually works at the uranium mine. And how you answer that question is very important in how the community reacts. And that might be a different question. I've had similar questions about nuclear power plants. So I think it's worthwhile for the ICRP to discuss the general approaches, but I think we have to have flexibility to deal with individual circumstances. So it's good to have discussion, but I don't think we should be overly prescriptive.
Okay, thank you. Nina, you want to continue on this topic?
Yes, thank you. I could just very briefly agree with what Doug just said, that it's a delicate topic, and of course you could discuss it a lot further, and maybe to have a general evaluation by the ICRP, but it is a tricky issue. Thank you.
Okay, Joseph?
Just to add to what Nina said, I think it's also a topic of concern because it's delicate, and we need to look at it holistically, most especially in the areas of justification for medicine. I have my own expectation. The expectation is it has to, this expectation for the patient, expectation for the personnel, and also for the general public, the PPP approach. So it is very, very important for us to look at it from that view. Looking at it from that angle, it will come with a lot of effort, a lot of plans need to be on ground in order to ensure that the issues of justification in medicine is broadened and actually looked into critically, so that it will be in place, so that issues will be discussed holistically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jim, with the ethical point of view on this aspect?
Yes, I think, as I said earlier, that one of the really valuable things that could come from the ethics in this period between now and whenever the next full set of recommendations is issued is to look at justification and optimization using ethics as the lens. The lens to date has been benefits and harms, so it's been looked at only in one perspective. But you could take any of the 4 or 5 or 7 values that were mentioned earlier, and you could say from the point of view of honesty, is this a good action? Or from the point of view, did we give enough information, which is important from an ethics point of view? It would be important for the dignity and autonomy of the individual. Was information given? And you could work your way through the values and examine the implementation of justification using the lens of each of the values. And you will learn a lot from that. And I think the Commission it would be an enrichment of the work of the Commission to do that as an exercise. And I think also it would provide perspectives on social acceptability that we haven't even thought about.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. This is one topic which is referred to in the paper produced by the former member of the main commission, the Fit for Purpose for the system, where justification is also referring to well-being, to the quality of the environment, and then this is some quite challenging issue with regard to how to put that into practice and which type of recommendation could be provided in order to get some good criteria to evaluate, or some good guideline. You mentioned the ethical value, which are quite important to be addressed when we have to discuss justification. But then that will be a huge work in the following years to really investigate this topic, and I'm sure that all of you will be able to jump into this work and to exchange with ICRP to better address this aspect of justification at the different stage of the implementation of the radiation protection system. So I see that Joseph has to leave or disappear from the scene. There is one question which have been put very specific, but there is in the chat some broader issues. There is one question mentioning that we need more animal for environment analysis, especially a long live one at the top of the food chain. So this is some element which may be referred to your presentation, Nina, but in a broader sense, what is your feeling with regard to the need for further research in order to fill the scientific knowledge for developing the system and to put it into practice, and notably, so not the general aspect, but what to do, what is missing, or what could be embarked from ICRP in order to better reflect the current knowledge or the need for further research. Someone want to comment on that? Nina, with regard to the environmental issue, do you have some feedback on that?
Well, not really. What I was saying regarding the animal issue is that there is not enough data at the moment to really take action in regulation. So whether we would like to continue on this path, it probably is some time-consuming events in order to fill the gaps in the science there. But I think that is what I have to say for the moment on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, so with regard in a broader perspective for the further need for further research or new knowledge to be incorporated, you have some comment on that? Douglas, you have some element to be considered?
Yeah, there's a number of concerns, and I think one area where we need to give a great deal of thought is the concept of detriment. And there's many aspects to that. I don't know whether it can be dealt with, but one aspect that I run across is something doesn't have to be harmful to carry the perception of harm and raise fear and anxiety in lay people. And I don't think the ICRP per se can deal with that, other than to perhaps increase the stakeholder involvement. And I think it's been mentioned many times to be very clear about what we know and what we don't know and acknowledge the uncertainty. I think truth is a huge factor in this. I think we have to acknowledge what we don't know. And that, I think, may help with some of these things that are harder to quantify.
Okay, thank you. Elena, you want to comment on this topic?
I have to say that this is not a topic I would like to give a specific comment. It is just coming just now on my mind that maybe we should also look about the concepts. If there is, we have reference animals, and then we have to look to other types of animals and so on, and plants. But maybe we should also take on board maybe any chemicals in this respect and how they are influencing. But this is really not my area, so I will say thank you. Okay,
thank you. Jim, with regard to new knowledge. You have to unmute your microphone. Your microphone, please, Jim. Okay, thank you.
Now we should be good. I think, other than to associate what I've said already almost with the earlier observation about COVID, that I think people during COVID have learned not just how to work differently and how to do inspections differently, but they've also learned how to live with uncertainty differently. And you know, it might be a good time to begin to, if you like, take on the mantle of uncertainty and accept that we're not going to get the full knowledge, but we have enough knowledge and we're smart people, and we should be able to get, if you like, keep the system working.
Okay, thank you. Joseph, you are back on the screen. Would you like to come back on or comment on this question of what new knowledge would be useful to further improve the recommendation of ICRP?
All right. One of the new knowledge, as I've said, is to look into the area of creating a new frontiers when it comes to the practice of radiation protection, looking into what has been done previously in the recommendations and annals, then coming up with a future direction that will help in addressing the pertinent challenges as itemized in this digital workshop. I think it will go a long way to provide solution and guide even the ICRP in reviewing the recommendations and coming up with policies that will further address the challenges in the practice of radiation protection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe a final question before to close this session. We had some discussion on communication and education and training, which are quite important and which are also mentioned in the paper from the main commission. What is your feeling and what recommendation or specific issues? Joseph already made a good presentation on this topic for the medical field. What would you recommend, or what is your concern with regard to improve communication with stakeholders and education and training? Some thought about that? Yeah, Elena?
Thank you very much. I think that it's extremely important that ICRP documents are very, very clear, and they should be very user-friendly for young generation. It means that somebody who will join the radiation protection community should be able to really quickly somehow swim in this pool. So with attracting young generation, I believe this is actually the future. So with young generation, the radiation protection community will gain a lot, will really gain a lot. So my advice will be to have a very, very, I mean, of course, the system is complex, but to write it in the way that young generation will really be attracted to go and work in this area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have only 2 minutes remaining, so I will ask you to be short in your answer. So, Joseph?
Yes, just to add to what Helena said, you need to look into the area, maybe coming up with publications on radiation risk to enhance communication. And through training, through education, there is need for us to also train the young ones so that we are equipped with policies that has to do with radiation protection practices. I think it will go a long way to help out. And coming up with a clear document, concise, then involving the stakeholders. Involving the stakeholders will be very, very important. The professionals, the associations, the regulatory bodies, all are critical stakeholders that will improve communication, education, and training in radiation protection. There should be a clear conduct. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nina, you want to comment on that?
Yes, I'd like to comment on the risk communication issue. And of course, risk, when communicating risk, it's even more essential than in other areas to have transparency in your communication and try to be as communicate in a straight and in a way simple way as possible, while at the same time making sure that what you say is correct. But I think that one of the challenges that is quite common is when you have expert fields with many very good experts, is that you communicate in a more complex way that it's difficult then for other stakeholders like the general public to understand, and to in that case try to keep it simple, but at the same time be very transparent in what you communicate, explain things and tell them about what are the arguments for different things, and if possible to use symbols and comparisons with different things to put things in perspective. That's usually quite effective, and I think that is valid in this field as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Douglas, in a few words.
I think I can answer by supporting what Nina just said. The need to be transparent and open and honest in our presentations, either to technical committees, but especially to the lay public, who are somewhat distrustful of the whole scene.
Okay,
open
thank
communication.
you. Jim? Your microphone.
Just very briefly, I think I by and large support most of what has been said. I think it's very, very important to pick the right person to do the communication in the medical area. Doctors are often not the best people. Nurses are often excellent and are often very well trained in communicating both risk and benefit and uncertainty and harms and so on. And secondly, that if recommendations are being made on the curriculum, for example, for medical schools, they should be checked with the medical school, at least one, with somebody who is the trainer in a medical school, because often the recommendations are completely impractical.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to the speaker. Thank you to all the participants, and thank you to the technical assistants and organization. I just to have to announce that this is the end of session 4, but this is not the end of the digital workshop. There is still a continuation of the discussion on the portal till November 3rd. So you are invited to check the record which have been made by different presenters. All this, the live stream sessions, the 4 live stream sessions will be available very soon on the portal as well. And you have about 50 on-demand presentation which you can visit. You can not only visit and listen to the presentation, but also interact with the speakers and engage through the chat some discussion until November the 3rd. And the last point, there is a planning to produce a summary of the workshop within the next few months, so you will be informed about that. And of course, all these elements will be further challenged by ICRP, of course, but in interaction with all of you, all the organization, and of course that will be also some topics for the symposium, ICRP symposium, to be organized next year in Canada. So thank you so much, and have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening or night, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you.